Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, past president of the Genealogical Society and the sponsor of this program. And today our guest is Sharon Hodges. We're going to talk about something that's very interesting to me, and that is German immigration in the 19th century. Sharon, I understand that your ancestor came in 1852.
Correct.
To New York.
To New York.
What do you suppose were his expectations at that time, and why did he decide to stay in the city?
Well, he was a tailor. That much is proven because it's on his ship list when he arrived that he was a tailor. He was a tailor his entire life. I can only surmise why he left a little place called Silesia in Germany. He was in a little town called Karlwitz. Silesia is on the easternmost part of, well, I should say was on the easternmost part of Germany. After World War II, when Germany was divided up, the lower part of Silesia went into what was Czechoslovakia at the time, and the upper part where he lived is now in Poland. If you go by Krakow, that would be the area that he was at. I can make a reasonable, I think, argument as to why he left there. If the family story is he was left on the doorstep of a Polish nobleman who raised him. You gotta love family stories. But I have not been able to find anything that proved or disproved that, unfortunately, not yet. I'm not done. But if he was a tailor, they had guilds, and if he was in a town that had all the tailors that they needed, he wasn't going to be able to join.
Right.
If he was not blood related to whoever raised him, he wasn't going to inherit anything. So, you know, maybe he didn't want to do military service, and maybe there was a reason he couldn't legally get out of Germany. You had to, or it wasn't really Germany then, but we'll call it that, because you had to make sure that you got an exit visa, you were well, you didn't leave any unpaid taxes, your family that you left behind could take care of themselves. And from where he left, he came out of supposedly France. And I think he was he went through Austria, which I understand was very lax in its exit, from what I've read, and getting out of there. So he came probably to New York because it was a town or a city where you could get a job.
And how old would he have been then?
He was only in his early 20s.
So he was military eligible.
He was military eligible, and I think he just decided, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And I think he probably worked as he got towards the port where he departed from, because when he arrived in 1852 on a ship called the President Christie, he was first cabin.
Oh, really?
Unusual, but he is first cabin.
Wow.
And one thing I want to point out, and then I'll get to yours, if you have somebody and you've got this ship arrival, look up the newspaper and see if there's any kind of a story about the voyage, because for my second great-grandfather, there is a story where his ship, the President Christie, at 3 o'clock in the morning, collided with a fishing boat out of Massachusetts.
Oh my goodness.
Had its bow stoved in. Of course, the fishing boat was a total. They brought the crew on and it made it in. But there was the story that I had that I wouldn't have had before.
Right.
And a brig, it turns out, which is the type of ship he was on, they're very short. They were about 180 feet. Do you realize that's half of a football field?
Oh my goodness.
And I'm like, better you, August, than me. Thank you very much. But I think he stayed in New York because he wasn't a farmer. There really wasn't any other place for him to go. I think he arrived alone. I have no reason to believe that anybody on that ship was related to him or that he knew anybody when he got there. Now, he arrived 1852, so this is before any immigration reception center was open, such as Castle Garden, which didn't open until 1855. And the story that I've always heard, or the saying is, you are left at the foot of the Bowery to fend for yourself. And if you had family, they would meet you, you know, or if you knew where you were going. I have no idea if he knew what he was going to be doing or not. And
But
he ended up living in a section of New York called Little Germany, Klein-Deutschland. And Klein-Deutschland, Little Germany, was 4 wards on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I think we have, if we can get it, we've got a picture of, there we go, of Lower Manhattan. Can't see it too well, but there are 4 circles over in the upper right-hand corner, which is like the 10th, 11th, 13th, and 17th wards in New York, and it's along the East River. Each one was a little different in makeup. Some were more industrial. The 17th ward was the last ward for Little Germany to come about. And that doesn't mean just Germans lived in Little Germany. They were the major people that lived there.
yeah.
And he lived in the 17th ward, the only ward that had open space, Tompkins Square, which is still there, and wider streets, and some of the streets even had trees and things on them. So he was fairly well off. And I think he stayed because he could get jobs, he could work. People needed a tailor.
Now, if he was from Silesia, would his German be this understood by other Germans, or was there a dialect that
I think was probably a dialect of some sort. There is a book by a Stanley Nadel that talks about Germans in Little Italy, or excuse me, Germans in Little Germany in the 1840s through the 1870s. And each area, each ward, and each block was made up of different, what I call sub-communities.
Yeah.
So you would have people from Prussia being in one, people from Bavaria being in another area, from Posen in another. And you could see that in places today if you go in cities, if you ride down the street, just by looking at signs and windows, you can see you've got a Jewish community, or you've got an Arabic community, or you've got Little Italy or something like that.
Right.
And all of these just kind of stayed in their own little community. So you wanted to be with someone that you knew was going to know the language.
And hypothetically, he may have run into somebody who he did communicate well with, who was maybe even a tailor, who said, come over here,
right,
and live here.
Live here. So people wrote back and forth. So there is that possibility. Now, the one thing, when you're left at this point in time on the Bowery, if you didn't have anyone to meet you, you had to be careful, because if you didn't know where to go, New York had what they called runners. Boston called them loafers, but these were immigrants that came in earlier, but they weren't doing very well. So they were organized, and they were taking unfair advantage of the newer immigrants coming in.
Oh, so these were immigrants.
These were
preying
immigrants that were,
on
yes,
new immigrants. Oh.
And like I say, they were organized. Matter of fact, when Castle Garden was going to be open, there were a lot of city officials that didn't want it to happen, because I think they were, according to what I've read, they were getting something out of this. But you would end up going, and you go, where do I go? You needed food, you needed shelter, you needed a job, maybe you needed medicine, you needed money. And all of a sudden, this person that speaks your language comes up and speaks to you in your own language, something like, hi, you look lost, can I help you? I've been here for a long time.
Yeah.
And what they were in cahoots with boarding houses. So he would take you to this boarding house, which would actually charge the immigrant more than he should have. By the time you wanted to get your luggage out, you had to pay for that. Or if you were going to be going farther west because you needed land, you would say, I can get you a train ticket very cheaply. But after you got off the ferry in New Jersey, where the trains were, your ticket was counterfeit. So this was one of the reasons that Castle Garden opened. State of New York wanted this not to happen. But you really weren't alone. There were things called immigrant societies, where immigrants who were doing well, German, Scotch, or there were religious ones like Jewish, all of these immigrant societies, they were actually there to help you. They would find you a decent place to live. They would see that you got taken care of. They would help you find jobs. They would not give you money, but they did take care of you. So if you knew about it, you weren't alone.
Just for clarification for our viewers, Castle Garden was sort of the early Ellis Island equivalent, right?
Exactly. Castle Garden opened, and it was actually an island originally with a bridge that hooked it to Manhattan, which now if you go down there now, it's where you get your tickets for like the Statue of Liberty, and it's all been filled in, but it is still there. But yes, it was, if you look at if you compare how Ellis Island and when the federal government took over and compare it to the way the state of New York ran it, it's very much the same. Everything was compartmentalized inside. Your registration, if you needed to find a place to sleep, they had an employment place. They had a place for you to exchange your money where you get a fair amount. If you needed to have your luggage sent on to where you were going to be staying in New York, they had an express place that you knew your stuff was going to get where it was going, or it was going to get to the train station. So immigrants were warned, don't deal with the people on the blocks once Castle Garden opened. And once Castle Garden, or I should say once the federal government decided in about 1890 that they were taking over everything, because they wanted all the ports to be uniform and who could come in and who couldn't. They wanted to use Castle Garden, and the state of New York said, excuse us, we've been doing fine without you. So if you want to take over this, fine, but you're not doing it at Castle Garden. Go find your own place till Ellis Island is open. And they used what was called the barge office, starting in about 1890. But I think he stayed basically my second great-grandfather because he could get a job. He knew how to make a living. He went to the 17th Ward. I don't know if he knew about it or why, but since he came off first cabin, I'm assuming he had some money, and he wanted to go to the more residential. Then he wasn't going to be a dock worker or an iron worker or a factory worker.
So he would have been a member of a guild in Germany or in Silesia. But were there unions, or there wasn't anything organized at that time, right?
Not at that time, no.
So he had to go find a job, probably through somebody else that he knew.
Or open his own place and then try to, but.
Which would be really hard to do as a brand new immigrant,
And again, I can only make a supposition. He came single. He married about a year and a half after he got in, my second great-grandmother, Philippina Young. And when he moved into Avenue A in 17th Ward. And looking at city directories for that time period when he moved in the 1850s, there was a Peter Young who was a tailor also living on Avenue A. Now, I can't say that he is related to my second great-grandmother. I have no way of proving because he just kind of disappeared. But when she came over like in 1851 with another single female. She was like 17. You don't go to a strange city take a voyage and go to a strange city like that unless you know somebody there. So I'm thinking
it was a relative of some sort, probably.
And they probably met that way. So again, great story. I can't say I can prove it.
But this is how genealogists think, though, right?
Yes.
You're always putting together a link some way.
Every little fact that you get, you can see if you can place it in or make it work with what you know about your family.
Did you say the 17th floor?
17th Ward.
Oh, okay. Ward. I was going to say that's a lot of steps.
No, there was no tall buildings, but a lot of the buildings in Lower Manhattan, in Little Germany, they were very crowded together.
Yes.
Extremely crowded together. But before we go there, I want to talk about moving day.
Yes, that's very interesting. I'm learning something new.
Most people didn't know there was a moving day, and in New York, it's May the 1st. Now, it didn't mean you had to move. This meant if you were going to move, you needed a larger apartment, maybe more family people were living there. Maybe it was smaller, you needed something smaller, either financially or whatever the reason. But if you were going to move, it was done on May 1st. And what you did, everybody packed up in the morning, and you didn't move far. And I think we have a map of Avenue A, and it's a fire insurance map, if we can find it, because I know we have two. But one of them is going to show moving. And it shows where my grandfather, second great grandfather, was on Avenue A.
Mm-hmm.
And what he did, yeah.
There we go.
So Avenue A is, I'm making sure that's the right one. Yeah. So he was on Avenue A, and all he did was they got their stuff together, and they just went around to Avenue B. That was it. So, and then finally he moves out of that particular map. But you got your cartman. If you needed someone to help you move some of your stuff, you would reserve a cartman in advance, because they were very popular. If you go on the census and one of your ancestors said it said cartman, very popular on May 1st, because people needed them to help move the stuff that they couldn't carry themselves.
Yeah.
And it's not like today. Allied van lines didn't come in front of your house and pack your stuff and move it. So you would move on. Everybody would then move in on the afternoon of May the 1st, because everybody was out and it was empty, and you could move in.
So if you wound up with two different censuses for 1850, one that was on April the 29th and one was on May the 2nd, and your ancestor was in both, that's the answer.
That's it. He moved. And I do have some that are like that. But, when I was doing the research on all of this, I was very surprised. I'm going, moving day? What is moving day?
Know.
But I have since discovered that even in New Jersey, Newark, New Jersey, had the same moving day, because they wanted to compete with New York, because if somebody wanted to move over, they could do it the same way. They'd pack up in the morning, and it would be empty on the afternoon. Indianapolis had it, other places, but they weren't all the same date.
Was it May Day? I mean, was it a holiday?
No.
No.
It
was just...
I have no idea. None of the background said why they chose May 1st. But you can actually see it. If you look in some of the early city directories, and you look at the calendars that they've got there, they begin on May 1st.
My goodness. Well, I learned something.
So it just kind of works that way.
So he moved then pretty quickly after
he moved in a year. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, or maybe the way the city directories were done, they covered a 2-year period. So he could have been like a year and a half to 2 years. But I think he probably married by then, and they needed a bigger place.
They needed a bigger place.
Because they had a child quite quickly.
Yeah.
But, and that's the nice thing about New York. They did censuses, state censuses, and the 1855 state census for New York gives you the county they were born in, if they were born in New York. Wow. It gives you relationships that we don't get in the federal to 1880. So it gave me a lot of information.
How far out do those state censuses go? I mean, how late?
They go quite a ways, but not all of them survive. So you need to look and see for your particular county what is there. And because there are some missing for New York. Matter of fact, the 1855 census for the 17th ward has never been microfilmed.
Wow.
And
Wonder why.
You can actually get it off of the New York Biographical and Genealogical Society. I actually went to their offices and went through 222 pages till I found it.
Oh my gosh.
This was before we had indexes and everything. I learned how to do this in the dark ages. But so he stayed there.
So what would this apartment have been like?
Well, usually there's two answers to that. One is going to depend on if it was just, say, a small family. But sometimes if you had extended family and you were on the same floor, they kept doors open so people could just walk in and out of the apartments. It was just like one big family.
Wow.
But what you had were several different floor plans of these buildings. In 1880, and a little before, there was a housing shortage in New York because of all the immigrants coming into New York, not just Germans. Matter of fact, by 1880, New York City was the third largest German-speaking city in the world. Berlin and Vienna were first.
Whoa.
And that's just because how many there were.
My goodness.
But people, as they got well off, they would move out of a certain area. And we've seen it today, as the Jeffersons used to say, moving on up.
Yeah.
So they would go to a different area. And some of these very large, old, stately homes were then cut up into apartments.
Yeah.
So they could actually have more people live there. If there was a backyard, they would build another building. If the building was brick or the front was brick and it could hold another floor, they would put another floor on it. Some of these floor plans were so bad that interior rooms, usually bedrooms, did not have light, no windows. So the only light you would get is if you opened the bedroom door and you had a living room with a window.
My goodness.
So you can tell air would have been terrible. And of course, forget plumbing, forget water. You were going down to the backyard if there was one and bringing it up from the well.
Oh my gosh.
And we do have a floor plan of a set of buildings, an outline that should come up in a minute that I want to explain. Yeah. Now, if you can see, there's things that look like kind of crosses in the middle, the way they're shaped. Those are air passages. After a while, it was decided, the tenement law changed, and it said you had to have light and air. You couldn't have these things. So you would have these air shafts that would go down however many stories the building was, so you would have some light in there. And I had to laugh because when I first saw this, it took me back to my grandmother's house in Paterson, New Jersey. It was retail on the bottom, which a lot of those were in New York. And then instead of being a lot of different apartments, by the time we got there, the 2 floors above was one house. And it was what we would call a shotgun house today. They called it a railroad house that you could stand in the front and look all the way to the back.
Yep.
Well, as you walked down my grandmother's house, to the left was a bedroom. And it had a window in it. But I remember you could sit there and you would see so close the building next door.
Oh my gosh.
It was because it had an air shaft, just like they were showing in that picture. And I never really thought too much about it because she had an outside unit. So she had a lot of light coming in. The lady next door, who I remember is named Ida, she used to make pickles in her bathtub. You could smell it. Oh, they were great.
Oh my gosh, in her bathtub.
Yes, at least she didn't make gin. But she had an interior one, so she would have had that air shaft on each side, and it must have been extremely dark.
Oh gosh.
But it just shows that these things were around for a while. One of the things I want to do is really investigate my grandmother's house and when was it built and all that kind of thing.
Can you imagine having like lots of kids and having these windowless apartments?
Yeah. And believe me, a lot of people lived in that house with my grandmother.
So that's why in the movies you see all the kids out on the street.
Yeah. I mean, who was going to sit in a dark room all day?
Oh my gosh.
But it was that way. But eventually, my second great-grandfather moved, and we just had it up there for a flash. If we can put that other map back up that was just there for a second, that other fire insurance map. That's it. If you get the opportunity, you want to look for, if you're in a city, for a fire insurance map. Now, we all think of Sanborn, but there were fire insurance maps before that company came about.
Oh.
This is a Paris, P-A-R-R-E-S. And you can see there's, it's 254 East Houston Street. There's a, whoops, can we have it back for a minute? There's a little red arrow down the bottom that is my second great-grandfather's home.
Okay.
The little dot in the center over the name of the street means there was a fire hydrant there.
Oh.
And a lot of these are now online, but they were done in black and white. You want to find the color ones. I actually went to the Library of Congress to get that because the key tells you the pink buildings were brick.
Okay.
The yellow buildings were frame. And the keys to where my grandfather, there was a business shop, retail on the bottom, and then the next 3 floors were residential. I'm assuming he had his little shop, at least part of it, down there. And in the back, they had a yard, but they also had another building in the back that looked more like a storage building.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these were just so crowded that they didn't have backyards, they didn't have the light. It was very, very hard.
Do you suppose his tailor shop was in the
I think it
retail
probably
area
was,
of the
because you
building?
worked close to where you lived.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of places recently have started, oh, we really need to do that, but it's an old custom.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
is. Yeah.
So
we are going back to that these days.
They
though.
are going back to that. So, but it was really interesting.
So the family moved to New Jersey.
About 20 years after they got there, around 1872, they moved to New Jersey, to Paterson, which was a textile city.
Okay.
And that was probably one of the reasons that they moved.
We've only got a few minutes left, but I think this has been really interesting. And whatever happened to them? How many children did they have?
They had 14 children.
Oh my gosh.
3 died in infancy, and my second great-grandmother, bless her heart, lived from 1833 to 1919. She outlived all but 4 of her children.
Wow. Sturdy stock.
She was sturdy stock.
Where was she from?
She was from Bavaria, he was from Prussia,
Oh.
and supposedly those 2 countries or states didn't like each other, so maybe they didn't talk, but they had 14 kids.
Or if they talked, it probably wasn't always pleasant.
Yes.
Well, Sharon, thank you so much. This has
Oh,
been,
you're
we didn't
welcome.
even begin to
there's
touch
so
the
much
surface
more.
of all of the information that you have, but it's so interesting. And it's so hard for us to think about living in those kinds of conditions, based on what we have today, our
Or coming on a
experiences
boat
are
that's only 180 feet or less.
Oh, and then being jammed
Yes.
with another boat. So thank you again for
Oh,
being
you're quite
here.
welcome.